In the last 20 years, the way that we look for and determine truth has changed more powerfully than it has in the previous 100. Where we once trusted newspapers and media companies with editors and fact-checkers, more and more we're turning to influencers, individuals with little to no oversight, who share sometimes extreme opinions to millions of followers. The perception is often that these people can say what the news giants can't, that no one owns them, they're free to speak the truth. But those influencers, and the ideas they share, like everything else, have a price. In the case of Lauren Chen and Tenet Media, that price was about $10 million. The buyer? Russia Today, a Russian state-run media company devoted to dividing people in the West and advancing Russian interests by spreading misinformation. Tenet Media was just part of Russia's most recent campaign to influence how people think about key issues in North America. The Canadians and Americans who went along with it raised new questions about what news you can trust, where opinions come from, and the power of an idea. In 2022, Lauren Chen and her husband Liam Donovan started a network called Tenet Media. Tenet was designed explicitly to be counterculture, to go against established beliefs. Chen, a Canadian, had been a conservative commentator since 2016 when she started a YouTube channel called Roaming Millennial. She grew the channel to about 400,000 subscribers as she expressed conservative views on social and political issues. Although born in Canada, Chen spent most of her life abroad, being raised primarily in Hong Kong and going to school in the States. At the time, Chen excelled in appealing to moderate conservatives, although her views became more extreme over time. She became a contributor to Glenn Beck's Blaze TV and Turning Point USA, and eventually wrote opinion pieces for Russia Today, or RT. In early 2023, Chen and Donovan were approached by a Brussels-born businessman named Edward Gregorian, who made them an offer. He would pay for Tenet to partner with some of the biggest conservative influencers on the internet. The network recruited Matt Christensen, Taylor Hanson, Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Lauren Southern, and featured prominent Republicans like Laura Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy. With the backing of Gregorian, Tenet was able to throw around huge amounts of cash to attract popular commentators. One YouTuber was offered $100,000 a week by Tenet, but before signing, that YouTuber was suspicious. Gregorian was a ghost. The YouTuber asked for a LinkedIn profile, a press release, an interview, anything to prove the existence of this wealthy businessman. Eventually, he was provided with a one-sheet that had some details of Gregorian's career. For him, that was good enough. He agreed. The messaging of Tenet's commentators was, as advertised, very different from accepted beliefs. One influencer called Ukraine the greatest threat to the United States and said the US should apologize to Russia. Influencers blamed a terror attack in Moscow on the US and Ukraine, even though ISIS had already taken credit for it. Chen herself adopted more extremist views publicly, alienating some of her moderate conservative base that had made her popular in the first place. That may have been because Chen was on the Russians' payroll since 2021. About a year after this all began, in 2024, the US Department of Justice released an indictment against two Russian employees of RT, Konstantin Kalishnikov and Elena Afanasieva, for failing to register as a foreign agent and for funneling over $10 million into Tenet Media. Gregorian had never existed. Tenet's mysterious benefactor was the Kremlin all along. YouTube terminated Tenet Media's account as well as 4 other channels run by Chen, and the DOJ began a more in-depth investigation to substantiate their claims. After the indictment became public, the influencers at Tenet released statements that they didn't know that Russia was behind the company. Dave Rubin, who has 2.4 million subscribers, posted on X that he and the other commentators were victims of this scheme. Tim Pool echoed the sentiment, adding, "I, as well as the other personalities and commentators, were deceived and are victims." Certainly Chen and Donovan lied about the source of funding, but at the same time, Gregorian's complete lack of online presence, in addition to Chen's history of publicly working with RT, seems like 2 obvious red flags on where the money was really coming from. But let's say they honestly had no idea. In general, it's unclear from the indictment to what degree Tenet influenced the messaging of the creators. It does seem as if the majority of the creators continued to create the same content, but in some cases changed the hosting location of some of their shows to the Tenet page. However, in one case, RT asked one of the founders to cover that Moscow terrorist attack I mentioned earlier, the one that ISIS took credit for, but from the angle that Ukraine and the US were responsible. After being asked by one of the founders, one of the creators said they'd be happy to cover it. This does seem to be an instance of Tenet directly suggesting messaging to one of their creators. Tenet also got raw footage from the creators at different points and re-edited their content to post on the Tenet page. Eventually, RT bypassed the producers at Tenet and started posting their content directly to the page. The interesting thing is that, in a lot of cases, Russia probably didn't need to change anything about what the influencers were already saying. The combination of hosting their content on the Tenet page and having Tenet put out explicitly pro-Russian content, as well as the ability to edit the creators' raw footage, allowed RT to spread the message they wanted to. The creators' content was used in ways they didn't expect by people they likely would have not agreed to work with if they had known who they were, and in that case, they certainly are victims. But the content itself probably didn't change very much. And that, I think, is the most interesting point of this whole debacle. It wasn't the ideas that were the problem. YouTube, the commentators, and hundreds of thousands of viewers had no problem with the ideas being presented. The problem was who was paying for those ideas. So are the ideas a problem? If so, should they be censored regardless? What if Russia paid to have someone say cats are better than dogs? Would that be taken down? I'm being purposefully flippant here because I don't know the answer. What should we be more afraid of? An idea or where it comes from? Well, I'll have time to think more deeply on those questions because according to the indictment against Tenet, they are just one of many networks in the United States that are working as mouthpieces for RT. It has been classified by the editor-in-chief of RT as an entire empire of covert projects that is working with public opinion. Now, take the words of a professional propaganda artist with a grain of salt, but the findings of the DOJ agree. Tenet is not the only company under the influence of the Russian state. And perhaps this should not come as a surprise. RT has been linked to destabilizing actions around the world. Beyond journalism, they've engaged in covert influence, military procurement, and cyber attacks. In 2024, they were linked to a campaign to influence Moldova's election, and have known operations in Argentina, France, Germany, as well as Canada and the United States. And in the United States, Russia has been attempting to influence elections since the 1960s, so the attempt is nothing new. What has changed dramatically since then is the media landscape. Beyond traditional news outlets becoming increasingly more partisan, social media has fundamentally changed how we get news. More and more, influencers are replacing TV broadcasters as the source of our information, and there are positives to that. Big news companies often have corporate sponsors and political allegiances. Independent news allows other viewpoints and stories to be told. But influencers frequently lack editors and fact-checkers. They can say more or less anything. And to get a social media following, you need engagement, and the best way to get engagement is controversy. Social media sites, which took a harder stance on limiting misinformation in the past, have all become more lax in the way that they police content on their sites. Mark Zuckerberg has said that he regrets Facebook's censoring of content in the last US election, even though in his own statement he acknowledges the content was only censored while it was being fact-checked. What this all leads us to is a very dark and confusing place. Governments in Canada and the US have largely lost control over the spread of misinformation. The social media sites and the few billionaires who own them have the biggest influence there, and are collectively deciding to do less and less to ensure that what is being shared is true. And having news fed to us through an opaque algorithm that none of us really understand leads to echo chambers and radicalization. Those who are in favor of this new way of spreading news say it's a win for free speech. But if the big news sites are partisan and owned by corporate interests or influenced by the government, then maybe we can't believe them. So we turn to independent influencers who don't have to answer to those people. But as we saw with Tenet, that can lead to more extreme and divisive opinions. Opinions that can be used and in some cases influenced by nefarious actors who have a vested interest in spreading misinformation. The brilliance of Russia's plan is that even when it isn't literally working, it still works. Even if no other media company in the United States or Canada is on the Kremlin's payroll, how do we know that? How do we know who is sharing their own opinion and who is pushing the agenda of Russia or another foreign power? This kind of distrust adds to an issue that's already reaching a fever pitch: the inability to tell truth from lies. The era of fake news has increased the divides between people. It creates confusion and distrust of official narratives and can change allegiances. Who 10 years ago would have predicted that parts of the conservative United States would favor Russia over other countries? That is the goal of these foreign interference campaigns, to divide people and make it harder to trust what we see and hear. Even as Russia is buying influencers, China is using AI and bots to post fabricated voter complaints on divisive topics. Iranian operatives hacked Roger Stone's email, and Americans are using AI to create fake images of Kamala Harris and Jeffrey Epstein, or photos of Taylor Swift endorsing Trump. So what happens next? Countries around the world are working to combat foreign interference in their elections and culture, but it's a losing battle. Ideas are simply too easy to spread, and once they've taken root, they're impossible to stop. Perhaps the only effective way to combat these misinformation campaigns is for us, as consumers, to change. To think more critically about what we're hearing, who is saying it, and why. But doing that means overcoming an algorithm that wants to radicalize us, questioning ideas and echo chambers that reinforce what we already believe, and choosing to relate to people who have different opinions rather than give in to divisiveness. Accomplishing that is a big, maybe impossible task, but for the time being, the heads of Russia today can rest easy, knowing that they've gotten their money's worth.